there's something called a calcium wave that seems to go across the brain and seems to actually move. I didn't notice there were different coloured light bulbs, and they said, no, that's your brain, open your eyes, you'll see it's still white light, and I did. You know, we're locked within the chains of our cavern.
Welcome to another episode of The Big Picture, Peake Experience, with myself, Robbie Graham, Steve Mera, and our special guest, Anthony Peake. Today we will be looking at the concept of the Infinite Mindfield based on one of Anthony's books of the same name, and the idea that we can access other realms beyond our everyday comprehension, through the use of entheogens, substances such as DMT, for example. But of course, there are other means by which to stimulate these kinds of, expanded consciousness experiences. Anthony, you don't have to use these, controversial substances. You can elicit these through other means, and you've had your own experience along these lines, Anthony. Would you like to start with that?
I have indeed, and yes, of course I would love to, because it was one of the most interesting experiences of my life. A few years ago, I was invited to attend a Scientific and Medical Network group meeting, the SMN, in Rawtenstall, nearby here, near in Bury. And the major speaker there was a lady called Evelyn Olasa-Valerano, who is an internationally famous researcher into near-death experiences, written books with people like Kenneth Ring. And she and I got on very, very well, and she subsequently read my book, and on her advice, one of her friends who lives in Austria, a consultant psychologist, had read my book. And he was quite astounded by the information I was giving there, because he had, as a child, he'd had a near-death experience.
All right.
And this had kind of changed his worldview. But there's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Engelbert Winkler. And Engelbert works with traumatized children. And one of the issues they have is that he puts children into very light trance states to help them. But in order to do so, he needs natural light. He needs sort of like they need to be outside.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas in the winter in Switzerland, with the high mountains and the valleys, well, in the Tyrol in Austria, the sunlight is at a premium because of the mountains.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So what he needed to do was to create a machine that could reproduce natural light. But what he then approached a friend of his, an old friend of his called Dr. Dirk Prokol, who's a consultant neurologist, and they built a machine that would work with normal light. But they realized they could do something more with this. And they realized that by using stroboscopic effects and flickering the light into flicker effects, they could bring about altered states of consciousness. Okay, now, they were very aware of the work that had been done, many years ago by somebody called Brian Geisen. And Brian Geisen brought out something I think he called a dream machine. And they were working on similar principles to that. Now, Brian Geisen, the dream machine, he worked with people like William Burroughs, quite an interesting period of time. But they designed this machine using neurological principles, because one of the guys was a consultant neurologist. So it's built knowing and understanding how the brain works and how it reacts to certain visual stimuli. And they invented this machine, which they nicknamed the Lucia, or the Lucia, but its technical name is the hypnagogic light device.
Right.
And they invited me over to test this out. So I go over, and we're in Evelyn's wonderful home in near Lake Geneva, and they wheel in this machine.
Wheeling?
Yeah.
How large is this?
It's probably about 5 or 6 foot high. And the only equivalent I can ever say to people is, if you remember the Gene Barry movie from the 1950s, the War of the Worlds movie, the original one, not the later one by Tom Cruise, and you remember that the UFOs were kind of like flying saucers with this kind of thing coming out the top with an eye, and it's firing these beams out and killing people. It looked like that. And it's quite intimidating. Because it looks like an eye. And they wheel it in, and they sit me down, and they put me in front of it. And they said, right, okay, we're going to switch it on now. We'll give you the most intense effect we can, because we really want to see what you think about it. So I close my eyes, and I'm sitting there, and it's flickering away. And nothing happened. And I'm about 2 or 3 minutes in, and still nothing's happened. And I'm thinking, I'm going to have to pretend that something's happened here. And then it did happen. And it was like somebody had taken a pot of paint and blue paint and had thrown it over my visual field. So blue light comes from this direction, and then red light comes from that direction, and then they start to swirl together like a classic near-death experience tunnel effect.
Yes.
And I feel I'm being pulled down this tunnel. And I turned around and I said to them, how did you change the light colour? I didn't notice there were different coloured light bulbs. And they said, no, that's your brain. Open your eyes. You'll see it's still white light. And I did.
And was it still flicking?
It was still flickering.
And can you see the flicker?
You can.
How fast is this flicker?
Quite fast. There's quite precise flicker rate. And they can increase and decrease the flicker rate.
That's interesting because it's a bit like Sake tests where we
Yes.
control the amount of light hitting the back of the eye because your eyes are oscillating as well.
Yes.
So it's actually closing and opening. So I'm wondering if the light source is getting through the eye to the brain when it's open.
Yes.
And only open and not closed.
And it's interesting you say that, funnily enough, because at one stage my eyes did vibrate. My eyes were vibrating.
Interesting, yeah.
And I find that quite disturbing, that my whole eyeball started to vibrate.
Yeah.
But anyway, so and that was one of the things that brought it to an end. So
there was no
no colour.
colour.
And so I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, this is pretty spectacular, you know. And but then I saw something down in my extreme right visual field. And I'm a classic migrainer, so I know when you have a scotoma and a breakdown in your visual field. And I turned around to Dirk and I said, there's something down here that's there. Can I look at it? And he said, of course you can, because your brain has now encoded it. Look away if you want. And I looked down, and even now I find it extraordinary what I saw. I was looking down, and I was in low orbit round a planet. And I could see the edge of the planet and the curvature of the planet. And it was blue. And there were lighter blue lines of flickering light in a checkerboard pattern running to the edge of the horizon. And I thought, this is just extraordinary. And I even grabbed the edge of the chair. I was so enthralled by this. Now, I've subsequently, as an aside here, when I described this incident, I was talking to Robert Bruce, the Australian out-of-body trainer. And Robert turned around to me and said, you were seeing what's called the lights of the world and the astral plane. And he said, look at the back cover of my book on astral travel. And I did. And it literally was what I'd seen.